Some of the mothers are like fathers too. My girlfriend's got.
Better be good that more mothers in there than our fathers.
Yeah, I'm like Jose
All right, we're ready. We're wired up, turned up, and open the Bible. So let's get started. Who's first?
Jesus is first.
You're right. He's right again. Will
you tell my wife that?
Pardon?
You tell my wife that?
Not if I'm in the same room with her.
It's recorded, so I'll just go back.
Yeah, you can.
Like he was talking about me.
It's a lot safer for me for that. All right, enough foolishness. Let's serious up. If we can. We are in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. We finished with the 23rd verse last week, but we'll go back. I think we'll go back to the 20th verse. Because Lori saw a quote this morning that I think fits this very well. Verse 20 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Now, Paul is writing here, and he's telling us that he becomes, essentially he's saying he becomes all things to all people, that he might be able to win some. And he's not saying I become like them, but I associate with them, I get to know them. If in order to win someone, we have to be able to win their confidence, their trust, their respect. If they're going to receive what we tell them about Jesus, if they're going to believe that we are real, that we have to get to know them to know us. There has to be a relationship there. And that's what Paul's talking about. He works with people of different personalities, different beliefs, different lifestyles, in order to be able to win some of them. Now, does he say he's going to win them all? No. We can't win them all. And if we think we can win them all, and we beat up ourselves because there's somebody that we tried to win and couldn't, then we're just going to drive ourselves crazy, because it's impossible to get all of them.
I think the truth is it's impossible to get most of them. Because,
I think you're right.
Because if we listen to what Jesus says about the highway or road to hell is broad, and then we see the narrow path.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why the highway to hell or the road to hell is broad is because of the amount of traffic that's headed there.
Right.
That would be like saying, hey, we're gonna detour all of 7571 down Tanner's Lane. It's not gonna happen.
Right.
Only the few select people who know about Tanner's Lane will be able to utilize it and use it to get where they're going in a different fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we have to look at, we're not going to win most.
That's right. And we can't let that hinder us.
Well, that's why Jesus said, if they don't accept your blessing, take back your blessing, wipe the dust of your feet of their town, and continue on.
Mm-hmm.
Don't sit there and dwell like, oh, why am I not saving this person? Why? Don't beg somebody to become a Christian. For the longest time, I felt like my mother-in-law was begging me and Jennifer to come to church and become a Christian, and that's not what got us into church.
Mm-hmm.
It was the understanding and need of God in a moment of what was going on.
Right.
So even though she tried, it was God that came and allowed us to have a personal encounter with Him that showed us who God truly was. So if somebody is reluctant against you, it's not that bad. It's not that big of a deal, because somebody you might know might be able to be on the same level and be able to, I'm trying to think of the word. We'd be able to understand how they are. Like, I could talk to people who went to prison.
Mm-hmm.
Dave can talk to people who's been to prison and jail.
Mm-hmm.
But majority of the people in this room would not be able to, because they would not be able to accept, okay, well, I've never been to jail, I've never been locked up, so how would you know what God can do for them?
It's hard to relate to them.
Hard to relate, that's what I was looking for. You can't relate with them. And that's why hobby ministries are good ministries. Because it allows people who, for the Palmers, it's motorcycles. Well, they can talk to people because they've lived in that lifestyle and they understand.
Mm-hmm.
Michael's cars.
Mm-hmm.
Will could be soccer because he goes to the soccer field. So it's just, that's why hobby ministries are important as well.
Probably anything that enables us to relate to somebody.
Well, that's what he's talking about.
Gives us a connection to them,
right,
that can help us lead them to the Lord. And in relation to this, and in associating with other people of other lifestyles and other beliefs and so forth, it brings me back to the quote that Lori saw on line this morning. Can you tell us what that is? Quote.
When Jesus hung out with sinners, they changed. He didn't.
When Jesus hung out with sinners, they changed. He didn't.
Yeah. I like that.
When we associate with others of other backgrounds, and we hang out with them, it should be to win them to Christ, and not be changing in their way,
right,
but changing them for Christ. That should be our goal. And not just to be hanging out with sinners because we like the excitement. Never mind. Don't get me in trouble. But speaking of these things and not being able to win everybody, in the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 14, I believe, Jesus said in the parable of the sower that the seed that he was sowing was the word, and that some of it fell on good ground, some of it fell on stony ground, some of it fell in the bushes, and some fell on bad ground. And only that fell on the good ground produced fruit. He gave 4 scenarios, and only 1 out of the 4 produced fruit. Don't quote me on this, but if we can take that to a logical conclusion, then 1/4 of the people are going to get saved. That's a loose interpretation. It doesn't mean a whole lot. Just something to think about. There are going to be more unsaved than are going to be saved. And he went on in that in that parable. And of the seed that fell on the good ground, 1/3 are
The enemy came and sowed the bad people into the ground.
that was and the other 3.
Right, which indicates that there's also going to be trials. There's going to be the tribulations and problems in the good soil. So, and we have to learn how to grow with that and not become consumed by it, because I did a deep study into the wheats and the tares. One, the tares, it will intertwine the roots into the good wheat and kill it, meaning that they've mingled together, which is not good. But you can't uproot it, because if you do, then you take out the good. You have to pull the good seed. You have to pull the good wheat away too. And it's crazy, because when I was doing the study in it, the farm workers didn't know which was good and which was bad until the fruit was apparent, which was what they call the ears of the wheat and the tares. That means that they grew all the way together until right before harvest time. Because, and nobody knew what they were until the fruit was being sown, right? And then when harvest time comes, this is probably a main topic of a sermon that I had, but when harvest time comes, the tare stands erected. It doesn't bow. When wheat is ready to be harvested, it curls over and bows over. So it lets you know, wheat lets you know when it's ready to be harvested, but the tare is always going to be in pride and standing up. So that's another thing that kind of stuck out to me when I was kind of like looking into like the wheats and the tares. But just because you're in good ground, that doesn't mean that there's going to be evil in the world that's not growing up with you. You have to be able to differentiate yourself from.
Jesus said of that seed that is sown on the good ground, that some would bring forth 100%, some would bring forth 60%, and some 30%. So even in the good ground, not all the seed that falls in the good ground is going to be 100%. We're not all going to be 100%. What does that mean? That means we need to quit looking down on people who don't seem to be as strong as we think we are. Because we're not all going to be 100%. And if we're looking down on them, we're probably not anywhere close to 100%. Probably more like 10%. So just remember, you're not all that.
That's right.
All right. Let's move on. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for a prize is temperate in all things. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So he's talking about an athlete and how they train for their competition. If they're running a race, then that's what he's using, because that was something that was prominent back then. They didn't have basketball and baseball and so forth back then. So he's referring to running a race. But he says that the athlete is always training, moderate in all things, in the way he eats and getting the exercise that he needs, practicing his running, practicing his takeoff, and so on. How many athletes do we have here? We have one. What's your sport? You wouldn't have raised your hand if I
I should, but that's, I teach martial arts.
Martial arts. Oh, you teach it. All right. I knew I needed to be careful around here. I know 7 dangerous words, so you
That's
better be
good,
careful.
that's good.
Julia, did you have your hand
Well, as you're talking about this, I was thinking about, John, who he decided that he wanted to try football. And he went through the conditioning and they're working on, building the body, and he goes into where they're practicing. And he comes home and he's like, Mom, my knees hurt so bad. And I was thinking about that, like, this is the first sport he's really tried. He hasn't really conditioned. He hasn't gone through that. So he basically overstrained his muscles. And like sometimes I was like relating that, since they were reading a parable to Christianity, like sometimes they hit the ground, they're running and they'll strain. You're talking about the ones that get away. They'll get strained, they'll get hurt, and part of it is you got to continue that conditioning. He's off for a month right now. And so when I talked to the doctor, and he said, well, you're gonna have to do something to keep your muscles so they don't lock up when you go back in a month. And same thing with like Christianity. We gotta continue practicing, continue building that strength, because then if we just like back away and then try to come back around in full strength again, then we're gonna lock ourselves up again.
And that's exactly Paul's point here. We have to keep our spiritual body in shape, because if we slack off, like she was saying, if we slack off, then it's hard to come back. And even a new Christian, firstborn again Christian, can't just jump up and take off and run a race. It takes them time to develop into a place where they're growing in the Lord. We could get into sanctification at this point, but we don't want to get too far off what Paul's talking about. But that's where sanctification comes in, and we start to grow in our godly conduct and holiness. But this takes practice. It's not something we just jump into. So don't be like I used to be back in the old days. Somebody gets saved, expect them to become an old holy person overnight. It doesn't work that way. It takes time to build up those things. But when we get there, we can't slack off, or our knees are going to stiffen up on us, and we won't be able to get back in the race. Lori and I used to own a physical fitness center, and we had bodybuilders that would work out there regularly, and they would have a competition once or twice a year for bodybuilding. And in between competitions, some of them would stay to their regiment pretty close, because that was their lifestyle. That's the way they wanted to live. Some of them in between competitions would just let it go. They would eat anything they wanted to, didn't care how much weight they gained. And then when it came time to get ready for a competition, they had to just crash everything. And they cut out all carbs and
Complete cut.
during a competition, during the preparation for a competition, there wasn't a chicken or a fish anywhere that was safe. Because that's what these bodybuilders lived on.
And they dehydrated themselves too.
And they dehydrated themselves. And they would become so grumpy and mean
Make you happy.
because of this lack of nourishment in their body. It actually affected their mood.
A buddy of mine went to a competition, or was watching a competition. He says before any of them get on stage, they just mope around. You can just tell they have no energy whatsoever.
Mhm.
He said they come out, they do their poses for like a minute and a half, they go back, and then it's like they walk off all mopey, They do their poses, then they walk on to the next one if they don't have another show, and they're just sitting there just scarfing it all down.
Mm-hmm.
He says it's crazy. He says it's crazy to
Yeah.
watch
Yeah,
because they're so depleted.
yeah. And I even knew, I remember one, I think this is correct, who would starve himself getting ready for a competition, and a day or so before the competition, he'd start eating, because he knew that wouldn't show on his body
Right.
fast enough to affect the competition.
Right.
So he'd start eating a few days ahead of time, and to get his energy up. And then we had one that worked for us that starved himself for a competition, and after the competition, he started eating, and he couldn't stop eating.
Right.
And he ate and ate and ate until his body started to swell up, holding water. And he was sick as a dog because of all that. The point of all this is that this can happen to a Christian in a spiritual sense. If we don't keep ourselves prayed up, if we don't keep ourselves in shape spiritually with prayer, with Bible study, with church attendance and service to the Lord through the church, if we don't keep all of this up for ourselves, then these kinds of crashes and peaks and weakness can happen to us spiritually. And that's what Paul's trying to point out here. And he's saying that in this 27th verse, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Paul concerned that he could become disqualified. Now, he's referring to the race,
Right.
and being disqualified for the race in this example that he's given us. But it could also happen spiritually, that we fail spiritually because we didn't keep ourselves in spiritual condition. So it's important. These things are important. Sometimes we don't feel like going to church. We don't feel like praying and so forth. And I talked to one young man who said when he doesn't pray when he doesn't feel like praying because he feels like a hypocrite. He doesn't feel like praying, so he thinks if he prays when he doesn't feel like it, he's a hypocrite. Now that's just a lie from the devil. If you don't feel like praying and you pray anyway, it'll only be a few minutes that you'll start to feel the presence of God, who is already there. So pray anyway, even when you don't feel like it, because God's there, he's hearing it, and you're going to begin to feel him. The lesson in all this is keep praying, keep studying the Word, keep in church. Of course, I'm preaching to people who get up early enough on Sunday morning to be at Sunday school at 10 o'clock. I hope some of those people who don't do that are hearing this online. Get up, start exercising. Oh, there's the camera. I'm looking up here. There's the camera. Get up and start exercising. We need to keep after our spiritual self just like we need to keep after our physical self. To stay in shape so we can endure. I don't know what this is I'm fumbling with. Oh, disqualified. I looked up a definition of disqualified. Signifies such a person as the judges of the games reject as not having deserved the prize. So Paul himself might be rejected by a great judge, and to prevent this, he ran, he contended, he denied himself and brought his body into subjection to his spirit and had his spirit governed by the Spirit of God. That's what we need to be doing. Let God govern our spirit and not our emotions. Where am I? Getting too excited here. Next chapter. Chapter 10. Verse 1, chapter 10, verse 1, Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. What's he talking about? Nobody knows?
He's talking about the rebirth of Israel and how it's an example for ourselves.
He's using Israel as an example for us. And later on here, he tells us that these things are written for our learning as an example to us. But right here, he's talking about a cloud over our fathers, over the fathers of Israel. There was a cloud that followed them, directed, guided them by day that God provided. And there was a flame of fire that guided and directed them by night. And that's what he's referring to here. And he says they were all baptized into Moses, the cloud, and in the sea being the Red Sea that was parted when Moses struck the Red Sea with his rod and the waters were parted, you know, all that. And they crossed over in dry land.
He's talking about, well, he's using it as like a baptism of the nation of Israel going through the Red Sea. And then after your baptism, like us, when we get done baptizing, we're supposed to allow the Holy Spirit to guide us. And that's where the fire and the cloud come into place as far as what's supposed to lead us, what's supposed to be ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's using the Holy Spirit for that as well. So that's what he's using in that sense.
Right. Right. So they had the cloud and the fire. We have the Holy Spirit, which is cloud and fire. You get in the Holy Spirit, you'll feel like you're on fire. Verse 3, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And here he's referring to the rock that Moses struck and brought forth water when they were in the desert and thirsty. You remember that story? God told Moses to strike the rock, and water flowed out of the rock. There's a lot of theories about the rock and the water and how they got water after that, but the water kept flowing and into like a stream that followed them, or the rock. Some even think the rock followed them.
The rock's Christ, and the living water came out of the living water that came from. Yeah.
For us, Christ is the rock, and he referred to it as the Spirit as the living water when he talked to the woman at the well. And so Paul's tying all of this together to Jesus and to relate to us today, to the church at Corinth and to us today, that for us, Christ is the rock and the Spirit is the water that flows, the fountain that never runs dry. And there's a song about that. I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. In the 5th verse, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness because they didn't enter into the promised land when they were supposed to. Moses led them to the promised land, and God wanted them to go into the promised land, and he had given it to them, go in and take it. And Pastor Wayne preached on this the other night, that Moses, instead of just going in as God told them, Moses sent 12 in to spy out the land and see what it was like. And they came back, and 10 of them said, no, we can't take this land. They're giants and all of that. And Caleb and Joshua said, no, we can take it. Let's go get it. But Moses said, no, he went with the majority. What did we say about that wide road? Going with the majority? Don't go with the majority. Go with what God says.
This also demonstrates what you were saying about the parable of the scattered seeds, right? Because you got to figure they get into the land past the sea, and you have those who the devil just gobbles up, which are those who bow down to the golden calf right away. They're picked off. They're destroyed. And then they moved on some more, and these are the ones that fell on the pebbles, and they started to grow because they had weak roots. Now they're scattered in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And you go a little bit further and you get into the thicket, and then they're consumed by stuff in the world. Now they're died out. Now you're to the promised land, which would be the good soil. But then once you even get into the promised land, those still didn't make it all the way through because they didn't produce what they were supposed to.
Because of all of this, of all the people that were freed from Israel's bondage and went into the wilderness and went to the promised land and said, no, we can't take it. Of all that generation, they all passed away in the wilderness. They all died natural death in the wilderness, except Caleb and Joseph and what's that other guy's name? Joshua. Caleb and Joshua survived, and they were allowed into the promised land. Even Moses was not allowed into the promised land because of his disobedience. So what does that tell us? Trust in God. Do what God says. Don't go with the majority. Stay on the narrow road. Do what God says. It was because of this failure to enter the promised land when they were supposed to that they were all lost in the wilderness. That entire generation lost in the wilderness. It took 40 years, and that's why they spent 40 years in the wilderness until this generation passed. And the next generation, God used to go into the promised land with Joshua and Caleb leading them. Joshua and Caleb got the promise of the promised land because they believed and they wanted to go. That's a lesson for us. Verse 7, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them. This is our example. They were our example. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drank and rose up to play. They sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play and party and have a good time. They weren't concerned with serving God, only serving themselves and using idols to satisfy that spiritual hunger in them. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, And in one day, 23,000 fell. Does that make God a mean God? No. Doesn't even make him mad at us. God is not mad at us. God is not a mean God. God is a loving God, but he's also a jealous, defending God. He will defend his people even if it means the destruction of the enemies. And that's what this is referring to, is God destroying the enemies of Israel so Israel could prosper. He's protecting his people because of his love for his people. It's not because he's vindictive, not because he's revengeful, not because he's mean, but because he's protecting his people. He's said over and over, I'm a jealous God. Being jealous means I'm defending mine. Don't get around us, don't hurt us, don't bother mine, because I'm jealous, I'm going to defend them. They were Israelites, but they were enemies of Moses, who was God's leader.
That's like having a kid who consistently robs and steals from you, and then finally he comes in with the intent to hurt you and you shoot him down. Even though it's your son or your child, you still love them, but you had to protect the rest of your family, right? Or, whatever you had to do to break, to stop them from causing more harm to the rest of the family that's obeying.
When I think about this kind of thing that God did, I think about a cancer that's destroying our body. And the surgeon comes in and cuts out the cancer, maybe even an organ or two, in order to save the body. And that's what God is doing in these kinds of cases. He'll come in and destroy the bad part and get it out so the good can prosper. And that's what was happening. In this instant he's referring to, it started out with one person leading and ended up with thousands. So God will protect his people, and he won't let the enemy overtake. That's why, and I firmly believe this, that if the church will hold fast and be true to God, even in this corrupt world, if the church will hold fast and stay true to God and not let the world come in and change the church, then the church is going to prevail through all the corruption that's in the world. The church is going to prevail against it until Jesus returns and takes us out. The world might be falling apart around us, but the church that's true to God, that's holding on to the standard of God's holiness, will continue to operate and function. I don't mean there won't be hard times. I don't mean there won't be struggles. But the church will prevail over the evil that's in the land. We might be outnumbered. We might be outpowered in government, but God outpowers the government. And the church is going to prevail. Can you speak up a little bit?
In my Bible, it titles this chapter Israel, a warning example. And the Israelites were the people of God. They were who he had called out.
Mm-hmm.
And from my understanding, it talked about the fire and the cloud and the water. And those people saw all of those miracles. They
Mm-hmm.
And, when I read about Moses and he was striking the rock and he was saying, I call the water, God, that's why he did the amazing promise land. So I feel like that same warning is for us, that we've got to keep our eyes on Christ, because when we take our eyes off of Christ, we can be just like Moses.
That's right.
Well, he told Moses he's going to see it, he's not going to take it. And it's in detail that he was on the mountain looking over into the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
He said, name your successor Joshua. That's who's going to be taken over. And then even before they entered the promised land, what they had to do, they had to complete the covenant. The whole nation of Israel had to complete that covenant with God, and they all had to circumcise themselves pretty much before they even went in, because of the separation that they had to leave, because of that whole it was a whole generation after the people who left Egypt, meaning that it was the second generation after Egypt that went in, because it was a whole generation in between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So
Moses was their great leader. Moses had led them through it all.
Right.
He just came Jesus.
he just got to see. That's what I'm saying. He just got to see it, not experience it.
Right. Because of his behavior. Brian?
There's a lot that goes into this. But I'm going to start looking at the 14th chapter of Numbers. In the 20th verse, it says, and the Lord said, I have pardoned according to thy word. So he was pardoning because Moses was pleading with God to keep him from being destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, but as truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. And then he says, because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times. That's what this is some of what he's referring to
Right.
there.
Yep.
The Bible says that they tempted him 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, my gosh, how many times did you have to mess with God? And then God just says, I'm tired of y'all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to wipe you out. And in fact, one time he said, even in this same 14th chapter, he said, Moses, get out the way, because I'm tired of Israel doing what they're doing. I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to start all over again.
Right. Yep.
I mean, that's how angry God got with the people who he delivered out of the enemy's hand
Mm-hmm.
to separate them to be a people for his namesake.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they rebelled against him after he had showed them physically all the signs, all the wonders, all the miracles, and they still decided they wanted to worship idols.
Right. Yep.
He had said, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. And before you know it, Moses goes up into the mountain for 40 days, comes back, and there's a golden calf staring him in the face.
Yep. Yep.
So it's something about this surely they shall not see the land which I swear to their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it, except for Joshua and Caleb.
Mm-hmm.
He slayed 603,000 people
Mm-hmm.
over a 40-year period of time.
Right.
600, that's an entire generation. He just wiped them out.
God means business.
He says, from the ages 20 and up was the ones I'm going to take out.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to take that root out.
From ages, well, that's the generation start, because he says, all men of war, 20 and older.
Right.
That's how you get that number.
Right.
603.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna wipe that whole group out.
Right.
40 years. And one of the other things I wanted to
disobedience. And Paul's telling us here that all of this is our example of how we should live so it doesn't happen to us. So we need to be careful. God means business. He's loving, and he'll do anything that's needed for his people, those who will love him and serve him. But for those who don't, these kinds of things are going to happen.
And he's kind enough to leave us a reminder.
Yes,
God left us a reminder in the Bible
this is our reminder.
what's going to happen, because, and another thing is you can take everything that happens in the Old Testament and run it parallel with stuff that's happening in the New Testament,
Mhm.
and then run it parallel. All time with God is parallel with each other, and it's a pattern, it's a repeat pattern, and you can see what's going to happen, and you know the cause and effect. So he does that so that you understand, hey, I love you, but keep doing this, you're going to get whipped.
Right.
And then eventually you're going to become so whipped that it's going to be a beating that you can't recover from.
Our time is gone. So in all of this, let's remember to do the things that will promote spiritual growth and endurance for salvation, and leave the rest of it to somebody else. Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson. Thank you for your word and all that you have done to save our soul. And we ask you, Lord,